ballroom of the Grand Hotel was glowing with soft golden lights that reflected off tall glass windows and polished marble floors. It was the kind of place where everything felt expensive, from the chandeliers hanging high above to the quiet music floating through the air. A charity dinner had brought together many wealthy guests that evening. Expensive suits, sparkling dresses, and the gentle clinking of glasses filled the room as people moved from table to table greeting each other. Waiters walked smoothly between the guests, carrying trays of drinks and small plates of carefully prepared food. Conversations were light and cheerful. Some guests talked about business, others about travel, and many about the charity event itself. For most of them, evenings like this were common. Elegant gatherings, polite laughter, and comfortable conversations were simply part of their lifestyle. Near the center of the ballroom stood a beautiful grand piano. It had been placed there mostly as decoration, though a professional performer had played soft background music earlier in the evening. Now the piano sat quietly under a soft spotlight, its polished black surface shining like a mirror. Most guests barely paid attention to it anymore, but one person did. Near the edge of the room, standing a little apart from the crowd, was someone who didn't quite look like the rest of the guests. The clothes were simple, nothing flashy, nothing that would normally draw attention at such an event. Yet the person stood calmly, looking toward the piano with quiet focus. They weren't staring in a strange way. It was more like someone recognizing an old friend. A few nearby guests noticed the person looking at the piano and exchanged curious glances. One guest whispered to another, wondering if the stranger had somehow wandered into the wrong event. At the far side of the room stood a well-known millionaire businessman. Many people at the dinner recognized him immediately. He was someone who had built a reputation for bold business deals and a strong personality. He enjoyed attention and often spoke louder than everyone else in the room. At the moment he was telling a story to a small group of guests, making them laugh as he described a recent business trip. His voice carried easily across the room. He was confident, relaxed, and clearly enjoying himself. As his story ended and the laughter settled, his eyes wandered around the room. That was when he noticed the quiet figure near the piano. At first he simply watched with mild curiosity. Then he noticed something else. The person hadn't moved. They were still looking at the piano. One of the guests beside him chuckled softly. "Looks like someone is thinking about playing," the guest joked. The millionaire raised an eyebrow and smiled slightly. He enjoyed moments that could turn into entertainment. "Thinking about playing?" he repeated with a laugh. "Anyone can look at a piano and imagine they can play it." A few people nearby laughed politely. The quiet person near the piano seemed unaware of the conversation happening across the room. They simply stood there, hands loosely at their sides, eyes still resting on the instrument. The millionaire took a sip from his glass, then gestured casually toward the piano. "You know," he said loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear, "playing a piano like that isn't easy. It takes years." Another guest nodded. "True. Not many people can play properly." The businessman smiled again, his tone playful but a little sharp. "Well, let's find out." He turned slightly so more people could hear him. His voice rose just enough to carry across the ballroom. "Hey!" he called toward the quiet figure. Several guests turned their heads. The person near the piano slowly looked up. For a moment the room grew a little quieter as people sensed something unusual might happen. The millionaire gestured toward the piano with an amused smile. "You've been looking at that piano for a while," he said. A few people nearby began watching more closely now. The quiet person didn't immediately respond. They simply looked toward him calmly. The businessman chuckled. "Go ahead," he continued, raising his voice slightly. "Play that piano." Some guests began smiling, expecting a small joke to follow. Then the businessman added a line that made several people laugh. "I challenge you." The words echoed lightly across the room. A few guests chuckled openly now, thinking the moment was meant to be playful entertainment. Someone whispered, "This should be interesting." The quiet person remained still for a second. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of walking away or laughing nervously, the person calmly turned toward the piano. A few guests leaned forward in their seats. Wait, are they actually going to try? Someone whispered. The millionaire folded his arms, clearly entertained. Well, he said to the guests beside him, this might be fun. The room wasn't completely silent, but the atmosphere had definitely changed. Conversations faded as curiosity slowly spread across the ballroom. The quiet figure walked toward the piano at an unhurried pace. The soft sound of footsteps across the polished floor seemed louder than it should have been. Several guests turned their chairs to face the center of the room. Even the waiters slowed down slightly, glancing toward the scene. The person reached the piano and paused beside it. Up close, the grand instrument looked even more impressive. Its curved shape, polished surface, and ivory keys seemed to glow under the soft light. For a brief moment, the person simply stood there. Some guests exchanged skeptical looks. One man muttered quietly, "This won't last long." Another guest shrugged. "Maybe they know a few notes." The millionaire leaned comfortably against a nearby table, watching with interest. "Go on," he said with a friendly grin. "We're all waiting." The quiet person gently pulled the piano bench back and sat down. A small wave of murmurs moved through the room. People were definitely curious now. The person adjusted the bench slightly and looked down at the keyboard. Their hands rested calmly in their lap. For several seconds, nothing happened. The silence felt longer than it really was. Across the room, someone whispered, "Maybe they changed their mind." But the person didn't stand up. Instead, they slowly lifted their hands. Their fingers hovered above the piano keys. Something about the movement was calm and controlled. Not nervous. Not unsure. Just steady. A few guests noticed this and stopped whispering. The millionaire watched closely now, his expression still amused but slightly more curious. The stranger's fingers gently touched the keys, but they didn't press them yet. For a moment it looked like someone remembering something important. The room had grown noticeably quiet. Even guests who had been far away from the scene were now turning their heads. Something about the moment felt different. No one could quite explain why. The quiet figure finally took a slow breath. Then, softly, the first note was played. The sound floated through the ballroom like a ripple in still water. It was just a single note, but it was clear, steady, and perfectly placed. A few people blinked in surprise. Another note followed. Then another. The melody had begun. And in that very first moment, something in the room began to change. The second note followed the first so smoothly that it almost felt like a quiet conversation beginning between the pianist and the instrument. The sound was soft, but it carried clearly through the ballroom. Conversations that had continued in small pockets slowly faded away. People who had been whispering a moment earlier now looked toward the piano with quiet curiosity. At first, many guests still believed the moment would end quickly. Some expected the stranger to press a few keys and then laugh awkwardly before stepping away. Others assumed it would be simple and unremarkable. But the person at the piano did not rush. Their fingers moved slowly across the keys, playing a gentle melody that sounded calm and thoughtful. The notes were not loud, yet they filled the room in a way that made people pause without even realizing it. A man standing near the back of the room leaned slightly toward his friend and whispered, "That doesn't sound bad." His friend nodded quietly, surprised by the control in the notes. Near the tables, a few guests who had been preparing to return to their conversations stopped speaking altogether. The music was still soft, but it was steady and confident. The person at the piano sat with relaxed shoulders and straight posture. Their hands moved carefully, pressing each key with purpose. It didn't look like someone randomly trying to remember a tune. It looked practiced. Across the room, the millionaire watched with the same amused expression as before, though now his eyes were a little more focused. "Well," he said quietly to the guests near him, "at least they know a few notes." A few people chuckled politely, but the laughter didn't last long. The melody began to grow. The pianist's fingers moved a little faster now, weaving together notes that felt warm and expressive. It was still gentle music, but it carried emotion. Several guests slowly turned their chairs toward the piano. Someone who had been halfway through a conversation suddenly stopped mid-sentence, distracted by the sound. Waiters moving through the room slowed their steps again, careful not to interrupt the music with the clinking of glasses. The stranger continued playing without looking up. Their eyes stayed on the keys, and their focus seemed completely absorbed in the music. There was something natural about the way their hands moved. The notes flowed from one to another without hesitation. Every movement looked comfortable, almost effortless. One older guest sitting near the center table tilted his head slightly and listened more carefully. "That's not beginner playing," he murmured quietly. The person sitting beside him nodded in agreement. At first, only the closest guests had paid attention. But now the sound of the piano was spreading through the entire ballroom. The melody slowly grew stronger, and with it the attention of the room. The pianist added more layers to the music. The left hand moved gently through lower notes, creating a steady rhythm. The right hand danced lightly across higher keys, forming a graceful melody. It was no longer just simple notes. It was music. Real music. A few guests exchanged surprised looks. Someone whispered, "Wait, this is actually good." The person beside them leaned forward in their chair. Near the back of the room, a couple who had been walking toward the exit stopped and turned around. They stood quietly, listening. The millionaire crossed his arms as he continued watching the scene. His smile had faded slightly, replaced with a thoughtful expression. He had expected the moment to end quickly. Instead, the music was only beginning to grow. The pianist's hands moved more confidently now. Their fingers traveled across the keyboard with smooth precision, rising and falling with the melody. Every note sounded clear. Every movement looked practiced. People began to gather closer to the piano without even realizing they were doing it. Some stood behind chairs. Others stepped away from their tables and slowly walked toward the center of the room. The crowd formed naturally, drawn by the sound. The stranger continued playing with calm focus. The melody shifted slightly, becoming richer and more expressive. The music now carried a quiet emotional pull, the kind that made listeners stop thinking about their conversations and simply listen. One guest standing near the piano whispered softly, "How long have they been playing like this?" Another guest shrugged, clearly puzzled. "No idea. But this isn't someone just trying their luck." The pianist's left hand deepened the rhythm, while the right hand moved faster, adding graceful patterns of notes that sparkled through the air. The sound of the piano now filled the entire ballroom. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered jokes. Even the people who had been the most skeptical earlier were now watching quietly. At the far side of the room, the millionaire slowly straightened his posture. His eyes remained fixed on the piano. The stranger still had not looked up once. Their attention remained fully on the music. And the music itself was changing again. The melody that had started softly now began to grow in strength. The notes carried more energy, more emotion. It felt as if the pianist was telling a story through the keys. Some moments were calm and gentle. Others rose with sudden bursts of movement before settling again into quiet beauty. The guests standing closest to the piano could see the pianist's fingers moving quickly now. Yet the movements were smooth and controlled. There was no hesitation, no struggle, just confidence. A young waiter standing near one of the tables quietly set down his tray so he could listen without distraction. He had never expected to hear something like this during a dinner event. Several guests standing nearby exchanged amazed glances. One man whispered under his breath, "This is unbelievable." Across the room, the millionaire slowly lowered his glass onto the table beside him. His earlier laughter was completely gone now. Instead, he watched with growing interest. The stranger continued playing, building the music higher and higher. The melody expanded into something powerful yet elegant. Each new section felt more impressive than the last. The room had grown completely still. The only sound now was the piano. Even the soft background noise of the hotel seemed to disappear as the music filled the space. A woman standing near the front of the gathering quietly placed her hand over her mouth, clearly surprised by what she was hearing. Another guest shook his head slowly, as if trying to understand how the moment had changed so quickly. Just minutes ago, the challenge had been a joke. Now the entire ballroom was listening in complete silence. The stranger's hands moved rapidly across the keys, yet every note remained clear and precise. The melody rose into a beautiful passage that made several guests lean forward slightly, drawn into the performance. The music carried emotion that felt real. Not showy, not forced, just genuine. For many people in the room, the moment had become something completely unexpected. What had started as a playful challenge had turned into something unforgettable. The pianist's fingers continued dancing across the keyboard, moving faster now, building the music towards something even greater. And with every passing second, the crowd around the piano grew larger, quieter, and more amazed. The melody continued to grow, and with every passing moment the sound of the piano seemed to take complete control of the ballroom. What had started as soft and careful notes was now turning into something much richer. The stranger's fingers moved with calm confidence, flowing across the keys as if the instrument had always belonged to them. The guests stood quietly around the piano. Some had moved closer without even realizing it. A few were standing just a few feet away now, watching the hands of the pianist as they moved quickly across the keyboard. The music had become more powerful, but it still carried a sense of control and balance. Every note felt intentional. Nothing sounded rushed or messy. A man standing near the front folded his arms slowly and shook his head in disbelief. "I didn't expect this," he whispered to the person beside him. The person next to him didn't answer right away. They were too focused on the music. Across the room, several tables had been completely abandoned as guests walked toward the center of the ballroom. Some people stood with drinks still in their hands, but no one seemed interested in talking anymore. The piano had become the heart of the room. The stranger's posture remained calm and steady. Their shoulders were relaxed, and their head tilted slightly toward the keys. The expression on their face was focused but peaceful, like someone completely comfortable with what they were doing. The music shifted again. The pianist moved from the deeper notes into a brighter melody that danced lightly through the room. It sounded joyful and energetic. The fingers of the right hand moved quickly while the left hand kept a steady rhythm underneath. A few guests exchanged surprised smiles. One woman quietly said, "This sounds like a professional performance." Another guest nodded slowly. "Yes, it really does." The sound filled the ballroom walls and bounced gently through the high ceiling. The grand piano, which had been nothing more than decoration earlier in the evening, now seemed alive. Near the back of the gathering, a group of guests who had just entered the ballroom stopped when they heard the music. They looked around, confused at first. "What's going on?" one of them asked quietly. Someone standing nearby pointed toward the piano. "Just listen," they said softly. The new arrivals fell silent as well. At the far side of the room, the millionaire remained standing near his table. Earlier he had looked relaxed and amused. Now he stood completely still, watching carefully. The expression on his face had changed. There was no laughter now. Instead, his eyes followed every movement of the pianist's hands. He slowly uncrossed his arms and leaned slightly forward, clearly paying closer attention than before. The music began to rise into a faster section. The stranger's fingers moved rapidly across the keys, yet every note remained clean and controlled. The melody climbed higher, building excitement and energy. Several guests near the piano leaned forward in amazement. "How are they doing that?" someone whispered. The pianist's hands moved from one side of the keyboard to the other with incredible speed. The motion was smooth and confident, like someone who had spent years learning every detail of the instrument. Yet the stranger still had not looked up at the audience. Their focus stayed completely on the piano. The music shifted once again, slowing for a brief moment before rising again with even more emotion. It felt like a story being told through sound alone. Some parts were soft and thoughtful. Others burst with strength and excitement. A man standing close to the piano quietly placed his glass on a nearby table so he could watch without distraction. "I thought this was going to be embarrassing," he said under his breath. The person next to him smiled slightly. "I think we were all wrong." The pianist continued playing with calm intensity. The right hand danced through a series of bright notes, while the left hand created deep, steady chords underneath. Together, The sounds blended into something beautiful and powerful. Guests who had once been laughing now stood with expressions of pure surprise. Even the waiters had paused again, standing near the edges of the room so they wouldn't interrupt the moment. One young server leaned slightly against the wall, eyes fixed on the piano. "I've never heard anything like this here," he whispered to another server beside him. The music grew louder and more dramatic. The pianist's fingers struck the keys with confident strength, creating a sound that filled every corner of the ballroom. The rhythm moved faster now, building excitement with every passing second. Several guests began shaking their heads in disbelief. One guest murmured quietly, "This is incredible." Another guest nodded, "Absolutely incredible." The stranger's hands continued moving quickly, but there was no sign of struggle or hesitation. Each motion seemed perfectly natural, as if the music simply flowed through them. For the guests watching, it felt like the room had been transformed. Just minutes ago, the dinner had been filled with casual conversations and polite laughter. Now everyone stood silently, completely drawn into the performance. Even people who usually paid little attention to music found themselves listening closely. The melody changed again. This time it softened, returning briefly to a gentle and emotional tone. The sudden quietness of the music made the room feel even more focused. The pianist slowed their movements slightly, letting each note linger a little longer in the air. The effect was powerful. A few guests closed their eyes for a moment, simply listening. Then, just as suddenly, the music rose again. The stranger's fingers began moving faster than before, racing across the keys with incredible speed. The sound grew stronger, filling the ballroom with energy. A wave of quiet excitement passed through the crowd. People leaned closer. Some guests stood on their toes just to see the pianist's hands more clearly. The performance was becoming more impressive with every passing moment. Across the room, the millionaire slowly stepped away from his table. He didn't say anything. He simply walked closer to the growing crowd around the piano. The guests near him noticed and made space as he approached. For the first time that evening, he stood only a short distance away from the pianist. He watched the performance with a completely different expression now. The earlier challenge that had started everything suddenly felt far away. The stranger continued playing, building the music toward something even bigger. The notes rose higher and faster, creating a powerful and emotional sound that filled the entire room. The pianist's fingers moved so quickly that some guests could hardly follow them. Yet every note remained clear. Every chord landed perfectly. The energy in the room kept building. People looked at one another with expressions of disbelief and excitement. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that a quiet stranger standing near the piano would turn the evening into something unforgettable. And still, the music continued to grow. The energy in the ballroom continued to rise as the music grew stronger. The stranger at the piano seemed completely lost in the performance, as if the crowd no longer existed. Their hands moved across the keys with confidence and speed, creating a powerful rhythm that echoed through the large room. The guests stood quietly, watching with full attention. Some had slowly moved closer until they were standing only a few steps away from the piano. Others remained near their tables but leaned forward, unable to look away. The melody became brighter and more dramatic. It moved through waves of sound that felt both exciting and emotional at the same time. The right hand moved quickly across the higher keys, while the left hand created deep, steady chords that filled the space with warmth. A guest standing near the front quietly whispered, "This sounds like a concert." Another guest nodded slowly. "It really does," he replied. The stranger's fingers continued to move rapidly, yet their posture remained calm. Their shoulders stayed relaxed, and their head tilted slightly toward the keyboard as if listening carefully to every note. Nothing about their movement looked forced. It was smooth, natural, and controlled. The piano responded beautifully to every touch. Across the room, more guests had stopped what they were doing. Even people who had stepped outside earlier had returned after hearing the music from the hallway. They now stood near the doors, curious to see what was happening inside. The growing crowd created a quiet circle around the piano. The millionaire stood among them now. Earlier in the evening he had been laughing and making jokes. Now he said nothing. His eyes followed every movement of the pianist's hands with deep concentration. The music shifted again. The melody softened for a moment, becoming gentle and thoughtful. The sudden quietness made the entire ballroom feel still. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are truly listening. The strangers slowed their playing slightly, letting the notes breathe. Each sound floated through the air and seemed to hang there for a moment before fading. Several guests exchanged amazed glances. A woman standing near the piano softly said, "I feel like the music is telling a story." The person beside her nodded quietly. "Yes, it really feels that way." The melody continued in this calm, emotional style for a short time. Then, without warning, the music began to rise again. The pianist's hands moved faster, and the rhythm grew stronger. The sound of the piano filled the ballroom with energy once more. Guests straightened their posture as the performance grew more intense. A few people near the back of the crowd slowly stepped closer so they could see the keyboard. One man whispered quietly, "How can someone play like that without even looking nervous?" Another guest shrugged. "They look completely comfortable." The stranger's hands moved from one side of the keyboard to the other with incredible speed. Their fingers seemed to glide across the keys as if they had memorized every movement long ago. The performance now felt bold and confident. The melody rose higher, building excitement with every passing second. The sound echoed beautifully against the high ceiling and large windows of the ballroom. Even the staff members had stopped working for a moment. Several waiters stood near the walls, watching the performance with wide eyes. One of them whispered softly, "I thought this was just going to be a small dinner event." The other waiter smiled slightly. "I think it just turned into something else." The pianist continued playing with complete focus. The music now carried a strong rhythm that made the performance feel alive and powerful. Some notes struck sharply while others flowed smoothly into the next. The contrast created a sound that kept everyone listening closely. The millionaire took another small step forward until he was standing near the front of the crowd. He watched carefully. The earlier challenge he had made now seemed almost forgotten, yet the memory of it remained in the back of everyone's mind. Several guests glanced at him briefly, as if wondering what he was thinking now. But he didn't speak. He simply listened. The music began to climb into one of the most impressive sections yet. The stranger's hands moved faster than before, creating a cascade of bright notes that danced across the keyboard. The sound grew louder and more dramatic, building toward something big. Some guests looked at one another with amazement. One man quietly said, "This is unbelievable." Another guest responded with a soft laugh of disbelief. "We were all wrong about this." The pianist's fingers continued moving rapidly, yet every note remained clear and precise. The melody rushed forward like a flowing river, strong and unstoppable. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the music suddenly shifted again. Instead of continuing at full speed, the pianist slowed the tempo slightly. The notes became deeper and more powerful, creating a dramatic feeling that spread through the room. The audience leaned forward. It felt like the performance was building toward something important. The stranger's hands moved carefully now, pressing each key with firm control. The sound carried emotion that was impossible to ignore. Some guests stood completely still, almost afraid to move or make noise. The music grew louder once more, rising into another powerful wave of sound. The pianist's fingers flew across the keyboard again, creating a brilliant combination of fast melodies and strong chords. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Several people smiled with pure amazement. The energy in the room had changed completely from earlier in the evening. What had started as a playful challenge had now become a moment no one wanted to miss. The performance continued building, climbing higher and faster. The pianist's hands moved so quickly that many guests could hardly follow the motion. Yet the sound remained perfect. Each note landed exactly where it should. The melody became bold and dramatic, filling every corner of the ballroom. Even the guests standing near the entrance could feel the power of the music. The stranger remained calm at the piano. Their face showed quiet concentration, but there was also something peaceful about the way they played. It was clear that this was not simply a performance meant to impress people. It felt genuine, real, like someone sharing something deeply personal through music. The melody rose again, faster and brighter. Guests began exchanging excited looks. One whispered, "This might be the best piano performance I've ever heard." Another guest nodded with wide eyes. And it came out of nowhere. The millionaire continued watching silently. The sound of the piano grew stronger with every second. The stranger's hands moved across the keyboard with incredible energy now, pushing the music toward what felt like the peak of the performance. The entire ballroom was completely silent except for the music. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And the stranger at the piano was only getting started. The music surged forward with powerful energy, and the entire ballroom seemed to move with it. The stranger's hands traveled quickly across the piano keys, producing a rich and dramatic sound that filled the space from wall to wall. Every note felt alive. It was the kind of music that made people forget where they were and simply listen. The guests stood in complete silence around the piano. Some had their arms folded while others held their drinks without even remembering to sip them. Their eyes were fixed on the pianist's hands as they moved faster and faster. The melody now felt bold and confident. It carried excitement, almost like a story reaching its most thrilling moment. A man near the front shook his head slowly in amazement. "I can't believe this started as a joke," he whispered to the guest beside him. The person next to him smiled faintly without taking their eyes off the piano. "I don't think anyone expected this." The stranger remained calm at the bench, even as the music grew more intense. Their posture stayed steady, and their shoulders relaxed, as if playing like this was completely natural. The piano seemed to respond perfectly to every touch. The sound of the keys echoed beautifully through the ballroom, rising up toward the chandeliers and spreading across the polished floor. It was no longer background music. It had become the center of the entire evening. Across the crowd, the millionaire stood quietly, watching with deep focus. Earlier he had looked confident and playful, enjoying the attention of the room. Now his expression was thoughtful. He had stopped moving completely. The stranger's hands flew across the keyboard in a burst of bright notes that made several guests quietly gasp. The music then slowed slightly, shifting into a softer passage. The sudden change created a calm moment, like the quiet pause before a storm. People leaned forward again, curious about what would happen next. The pianist allowed the softer notes to float gently through the room, giving the audience a moment to breathe. Then the melody began to rise again. The rhythm grew stronger. The fingers moved faster. The music climbed toward a powerful ending that everyone could feel approaching. Several guests exchanged excited looks. A woman standing near the front whispered, "This is incredible." Another guest nodded. "It's like watching a concert." The crowd had grown even larger now. People who had been sitting at distant tables had joined the circle around the piano. Some guests even stood on their toes to see the pianist more clearly. Yet the stranger still hadn't looked up. Their attention remained completely focused on the keys. The melody now rushed forward with energy, bright and bold. The pianist's right hand danced across the higher notes, while the left hand created deep, powerful chords underneath. The sound felt full and dramatic. One guest standing near the edge of the crowd quietly placed both hands on the back of a chair, leaning forward to watch more closely. "How can someone play like that?" he murmured. No one answered. They were too busy listening. The music continued building toward its peak. The pianist's hands moved faster than ever, creating a flowing wave of notes that filled the entire room. The rhythm was strong and confident, almost like a heartbeat driving the performance forward. A few guests smiled in pure amazement. Others simply stared. It was clear now that the stranger was not just talented. This was someone who had spent years mastering the instrument. The melody suddenly rose into one of the most dramatic sections yet. The pianist struck the keys with controlled strength, producing a bold and powerful sound that echoed through the ballroom. The audience felt the energy immediately. A man near the back whispered quietly, "That gave me chills." Another guest nodded slowly. Same here. The stranger's fingers continued to move rapidly across the keyboard, but there was still perfect control in every motion. Then, slowly, the music began to change again. The pace softened. The notes became deeper and more thoughtful. It felt like the story within the music was reaching its final chapter. The crowd listened carefully. Some guests stood completely still, almost afraid to move. The pianist allowed the melody to slow down, letting each note ring clearly before moving to the next. The quiet moments were just as powerful as the louder ones. The room had become so silent that the soft sound of the piano pedals could be heard beneath the music. The stranger's hands moved gently across the keyboard now, guiding the melody toward its ending. Several guests exchanged emotional glances. A woman quietly whispered, "I didn't expect tonight to turn into something like this." Her friend smiled softly. Neither did anyone else. Near the front of the crowd, the millionaire stood watching the pianist with a completely different expression than before. There was no trace of the earlier laughter. Instead, there was respect. He slowly shook his head, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The music continued softly for a few more moments, building one last emotional wave. The pianist's fingers moved carefully, creating a beautiful combination of gentle notes and deep chords. It felt like the final part of a powerful story. The guests leaned forward slightly, waiting for the final moment. Then the music began to rise one last time. The stranger played a short but brilliant passage, the notes climbing higher and faster before suddenly slowing again. The sound filled the ballroom with one last burst of beauty. Then came the final chord. The pianist pressed the keys firmly, creating a deep and powerful sound that echoed through the entire room. For a brief moment, the note hung in the air. Then it slowly faded. Silence followed. Complete silence. The stranger's hands rested quietly on the piano keys. No one moved. No one spoke. The guests looked at one another with expressions of shock and amazement. It felt as if the entire room had forgotten how to react. The performance had been so unexpected, so powerful, that people needed a moment to understand what they had just witnessed. Finally, one person began to clap. The sound broke the silence. Another guest joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into loud applause. People clapped with excitement and admiration, some even cheering softly. The strangers slowly lifted their hands from the keys. For the first time since the performance had started, they turned slightly on the bench and looked toward the crowd. Their expression was calm and humble. The applause continued to grow. Guests smiled, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Near the front of the crowd, the millionaire stepped forward slightly, still clapping with everyone else. The playful challenge that had started the moment now felt like something completely different. The room had witnessed something extraordinary, and the mystery of the quiet stranger had only just begun. The applause continued to echo through the ballroom long after the final note had faded. Guests clapped with genuine excitement, some even shaking their heads as if they still could not believe what they had just witnessed. What had begun as a playful challenge had turned into one of the most unforgettable moments of the evening. The stranger slowly stood up from the piano bench. Their movements were calm and humble, as if they were not expecting such a strong reaction. The crowd remained gathered around the piano, smiling and applauding. Several guests began speaking at once. "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that here before. Where did you learn to play like that?" The stranger gave a small, polite nod to the audience but did not immediately say anything. Their calm expression made the moment feel even more genuine. The millionaire, who had started the whole situation with his challenge, slowly stepped closer through the crowd. People made space for him as he approached the piano. The applause gradually softened, but the excitement in the room remained. He stood only a few feet away from the stranger now. For a moment he simply looked at the piano, then back at the person who had just played it. His earlier confidence had been replaced with something different. Respect. He gave a small smile and shook his head slightly. "I didn't expect that," he said honestly. A few guests near him chuckled softly, but the tone was friendly now. The stranger gave a quiet nod, still standing beside the piano bench. The millionaire looked around at the crowd and then back at the pianist. When you were standing there earlier, he continued, I thought you were just curious about the piano. The stranger smiled faintly. I was, they replied calmly. The simple answer made a few people in the crowd smile. Someone near the front asked the question that many were already thinking. Have you been playing for a long time? The stranger paused for a moment before answering. Yes, they said gently. For many years. The crowd listened carefully. The person continued speaking in a calm, natural voice. I started learning when I was very young. At first it was just something I enjoyed. I never thought much about performing in front of people. A few guests nodded quietly. One of the older guests near the piano leaned forward slightly. But you play like someone who has spent a lifetime practicing. The stranger smiled again. I suppose I have. Several people laughed softly at the modest reply. The millionaire folded his arms loosely, still watching with interest. So you're a professional musician? He asked. The stranger shook their head slowly. No, I've mostly played in small places. Community events, local gatherings, sometimes teaching a few students who want to learn. The answer surprised many people in the crowd. Someone whispered quietly, That's hard to believe. Another guest spoke up. If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you say anything earlier? The stranger glanced at the piano before answering. There wasn't really a reason to, they said simply. I was just enjoying the evening like everyone else. The honesty in the response made several guests smile again. The moment felt warm and natural now. What had started as a challenge had turned into a conversation filled with curiosity and respect. The millionaire looked thoughtful for a moment. Then he gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head again. I guess I learned something tonight, he admitted. The crowd listened closely. I shouldn't have assumed you couldn't play. The stranger didn't seem offended. Instead, they gave a friendly nod. It happens often, they said calmly. Several guests nearby laughed softly. One woman spoke with a smile. Well, I'm glad it happened tonight. The people around her nodded in agreement. Another guest added, That performance made this entire evening special. The stranger looked slightly surprised by the praise but accepted it politely. Across the room, a few guests who had recorded small clips on their phones quietly talked about how amazing the performance had been. Some were already saying they would remember this moment for a long time. One man near the back of the crowd said quietly, This is the kind of thing you never expect to see. His friend nodded. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Near the piano, the millionaire extended his hand toward the stranger. Thank you for accepting the challenge, he said sincerely. The stranger shook his hand politely. Thank you for giving me a reason to play, they replied. The simple exchange made the crowd smile again. The atmosphere in the ballroom had completely changed from earlier in the evening. The formal dinner now felt warmer and more connected. Guests who had never spoken before were now sharing thoughts about the performance. The piano itself sat quietly once again under the soft lights. But now it felt different. It was no longer just decoration. It had become the center of a story everyone would remember. One of the guests near the front spoke up again. Will you play another piece? Several people looked hopeful. But the stranger gently shook their head. Maybe another time, they said kindly. The crowd accepted the answer with understanding. After such a powerful performance, no one wanted to pressure the moment. Instead, people continued thanking the pianist and sharing their appreciation. Some guests returned slowly to their tables, still talking about the music they had just heard. Others stayed near the piano a little longer, replaying the moment in their minds. The millionaire remained near the front of the room, quietly watching the stranger speak with a few guests. Finally, he looked around the ballroom and smiled slightly. I think this dinner just became a lot more interesting, he said to the people standing near him. They laughed and agreed. The music had brought everyone together in a way that no speech or presentation could have done. As the evening continued, the story of the unexpected piano performance spread through the room. Guests who had stepped away earlier returned, asking what they had missed. And those who had been there from the beginning happily told the story again. They spoke about the quiet stranger standing near the piano, about the playful challenge, and about the moment when the first note changed everything. Long after the dinner ended and the guests began leaving the ballroom, many were still talking about the performance. Some said it reminded them not to judge people too quickly. Others said it proved that talent can appear in the most unexpected places. But everyone agreed on one thing. That night, a simple challenge had turned into something unforgettable. And somewhere in the quiet corner of the ballroom, the grand piano waited silently, as if it knew that it had helped create a story people would remember for years.